I hope everybody is well fed. Thank you to AVERT for a delicious lunch. And we are going to get started with the session. The session is on policy challenges for preventing and countering violent extremism. We have three presenters. Our second presenter is online, and our other presenters are here. We will have time at the end of the entire session for a Q&A. There will be a little, our third presenters are going to do their own little Q&A before we come back to one for the whole panel. Just so everybody's aware of that slight tweak for this session. Our first presenter is Professor Sissel, Jore, and she's presenting on the hybrid threat landscape as a challenge to current PCVE policies in Scandinavia.
Thank you. This has been a really interesting conference so far. I have really enjoyed it, met a lot of nice people. And many have asked me if I came all the way from Norway to do this presentation, and I actually didn't. I'm currently a visiting scholar in Perth, at Stavanger University. So, but I flew all the way from the other coast to get here. So just so you know. So I want to talk to you about the hybrid threat landscape, and I'm going to go through a little bit about the Scandinavian model, so you get an impression of what it is. Because after listening to this conference for 1.5 days, I realized that counter-radicalization, counter-terrorism policies looks different in Scandinavia than they do here. Probably more different than I expected before I got here. So a lot of people have talked about this hybrid, what I refer to as the hybrid terrorism threat landscape. We're seeing a more diverse, more fragmented threat landscape, characterized that people like picking their own ideology, much more internet radicalization and so on. And this has gotten many names. Some call it like salad bar, you pick your own, or pick your shoes. But this, and also this technology is also very often presented as something that will be a challenge to how to counter terrorism in the future. So that's like the one hybrid threat. That's like the hybrid terrorism threat. I will come back to this. But just so I have clarified where I talk to, there is also one more hybrid threat landscape, and that is the hybrid state threats. And I'm not sure what expression you use here in Australia, but in Norway we call it hybrid threats, as the UK call it state threats. So this concept varies a little. But we have a new situation after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2002. We see in Norway a lot of interference from Russia that we didn't see previously. It's probably been there the whole time, but we have discovered it after the invasion of Ukraine. So what has happened in the last 2 years is that, for example, we have had a lot of drone activity that we, or the police think, come from Russia on our oil and gas platform, on critical infrastructure. We had visiting scholars being expelled from universities because they are spies. We had research ships going near the coast, detecting everything like cables and so on. So we are used to being a little safe society up in the north where nothing happened. And because we now we have a border with Russia in the north, we now see a lot of activity, and we also see the state threats here in a totally different way than we used to. And this is not just like the traditional state threats like espionage and so on. This also affects terrorism and political discourse. So the example I have here on the picture is from the burning of the Quran. This has been a really debated issue. Oh, you don't have it? No. Yes. All right. Now we have the language. So the picture here is from one of the Finnish minister who claimed that one of the, or like the most prominent guy who traveled around in Scandinavia burning the Quran actually is supported by Russia. I can't tell you if it's true or not, but I've seen this claim many times. We also had in Norway, because even though we haven't been so much in the media with the debates and controversies with burning the Quran as Sweden and Denmark have, we also had cases in Norway where immigrants in Norway received text messages saying that they should revenge the burning of the Quran in Norway. And this security police in Norway traced this back to Russian activist group. It's hard to say whether it is the Russian state, but it's traced back to Russia. So this also shows, how this hybridity between terrorism, state threats, radicalization, and so on, it's become very complicated. And it's become very complicated for the traditional actors that deal with terrorism and radicalization and so on. So that is like the background for my talk. So just to give you a little introduction to the Scandinavian model of how to prevent radicalization. So I have referred to this model as the welfare state model of preventing radicalization. I know that is not so popular in Norway often to call it that, but I think it's a very good description actually of what it is, because it is a model where the local community takes a lot of responsibility for preventing radicalization. And when I say the local community here, it's the municipality level I'm talking about. Norway is a small country compared to Australia, so it's really like the local communities, meaning municipality I'm talking about. And in this role of preventing radicalization, teachers, social workers, those who work with vulnerable people are the ones who are in the forefront of countering radicalization. And this model of radicalization is really built on avoiding exclusion and marginalization. So it's bringing people back into society. That's the whole idea about this model, giving them jobs, apartments, helping them to build network and so on. That's the whole idea, like finding individuals who thrive in the local community. And this model has its proponents and it has its critics. But I would say that in Norway, this is a very popular model. It is a model that for those who actually do this work, which you should expect maybe would be critical of having a role of a security, because they've somehow become security agents. But this hasn't really been a debate like it has been in the UK, because this is seen as a way of safeguarding vulnerable individuals. And it's based on the same model we have for preventing crimes. So it builds on early intervention, and then if something goes wrong, rehabilitation back into local community. So even though there are some few negative voices, that's not the case. It's really a popular in Norway. It's a really popular way of approaching how to deal with radicalization. So in many ways, this model builds on this tunnel view on what radicalization is that we discussed a little bit yesterday. It is this idea that you have an individual that is vulnerable, and then you have to stop this individual along the process of becoming, the end point then would be the commitment to use violence as a political means in the end. And this model has been very much debated in research, but it's also, what has not been so much debated is that it is also a model that when you have this model of how to prevent radicalization, it really puts the focus on the individual. And it kind of removes the structural causes of why terrorism or radicalization occurs. So it puts a lot of focus on the individual and the psychological aspects of the individual. So just keep that in mind, because I will bring this back to in the end of the presentation. So during the last 1.5 years, I have been a member of a government-appointed commission, and what the task we had to do was this is a defense commission, so it's not a commission that deals with radicalization and terrorism per se, but what we were told to do was to line out the threat picture for Norway the next 10 to 15, 20 years ahead. It's a difficult and huge task, almost impossible, especially when you suddenly find yourself being in the middle of a warlike situation in Europe. But I think having long-term perspectives are very important. I think that we also need to look ahead, also far ahead of what's there. So I want to describe to you some of those trends that we looked at and described in this report, because I think they also are applicable and valid for what we will see in terms of how this will influence terrorism and radicalization also in the future. So the three trends I would like to tell you a little bit about is the first I have called the New World Order, the second is technology, and the third is what I have called the social contract. There are other trends also described in this report. You can find it online if you want to read it, but I would recommend it to read the chapters where we describe the threat picture, because I think that would be most relevant for the ones of you who are in this room. So, the New World Order. We have seen very clearly during Corona and also with the war in Ukraine, this is a new era. It's a new geopolitical area. We can't go back to where we were. Those crises have caused a whole new situation in many ways. And some say it might be the end of the unipolar world as we know it, and we have seen this with cooperation between the US and the Western states on one side, and then you have China, Russia, and authoritarian regimes on the other side. And this will also have consequences for how the international society deal with radicalization, because it means that terrorism, radicalization is not the most pressing security issue anymore. This is war, sanction, and other things, economy, that will be the issues of the grand political actors. And what we have seen very clearly with both COVID and Ukraine is that they challenge the world order and they lead to this decoupling, that states look for themselves and for their own interests much more than unite for a global solution to a global problem in a whole new way. And we see this lack of global cooperation, which is just an example of that is that most states aren't supporting the sanction against Russia, for example. And we have seen this, how new areas become security politics. The example of that from a Norwegian perspective would be the oil and gas industry, which for us is a way to earn money, but now it suddenly has become international politics. So this is a new situation. It means that we will much see that the grand powers will try to influence the local small states, like a small Australia. I'm calling Australia small. It's not compared to Norway, but I hope you understand what I mean. I'm not going to dwell so much on that trend because I think a lot of you have dwelt up on this before. We also looked at technology, and that is the thing we haven't talked so much about in this conference. So technology and terrorism has always gone hand in hand. It's like you can trace it back to the Olympics in München, where they chose to target the Olympics because there were international press there, so they could communicate their political message out to the whole world. Then you have 9/11. It's also a good example of how technology goes hand in hand with terrorism. You had the people standing there with video camera actually filming what was going on, and you can broadcast this out to the whole world. 9/11 probably wouldn't have that strong impression if it wasn't for the new technology at the time. ISIS is another example. They were able to influence or use social media in recruiting in a whole new way that we hadn't seen before. So I think this technology will impact terrorism and what kind of threat we see in the future. That's something we just should expect in a way. So what I want to highlight for you is really that a lot of radicalization these days are happening on the internet. But on the internet, there are deep fakes. And deepfakes technology is out there. It's something you can buy. So you can now, after you have recorded my speech here today, you can go in, you can copy me, and you can make new words coming out of my mouth with my voice, my look. And this isn't like science fiction into the future. This is current technology that you can use. And just think of it, how of a big opportunity this is for people with bad intentions or who want to frame someone negatively. And you also have this 3D printing. Someone yesterday said that, yeah, but the difference between Australia and US is that they don't have access to gun, but 3D printing gives new actors access to, for example, guns. We've seen this in Japan. There was an attempt to shoot the prime minister, but we also seen this in Iceland. And I'm going to be a little bit careful with using the Iceland example because it's more like a plot, so I'm not sure how concrete it was, but they had planned to 3D print guns and storm the parliament. So from my knowledge of it. So, and then you have the artificial intelligence. You know, we've seen this on, for those of you who have tried ChatGPT, this is a communication tool and it really writes better, even Norwegian better than most of my students. It's fascinating and it's scary. I don't know how to test them anymore, you know. And it kind of answer you back in a kind of a smart way, you know. It's like you wouldn't necessarily detect that this is artificial intelligence behind this. So this is also like, we don't know how this algorithm actually, how do they affect us? How can they be used also by groups and others? This is also where we should be careful in the future. And then we talked, so the previous speaker before me talked a little about the role of the tech companies and the programmed algorithms. We have the echo chamber and we have this tendency to that the extreme view gets more attention on social media than the middle ground. So the last trend is what I have referred to the social contract. There is this mismatch between how we have rigged ourselves, a democracy and so on, and the expectations. We see this lack of trust and battle for truth is there. And this is something we will see more of in the future as long as the new technology and social media and internet takes over. So what does this mean really for the Scandinavian model? It means that, as I said, our model is very much built on trust, that you have trust in the government, that you have trust in those who do the prevention. It's very much built in safeguarding vulnerable individuals and so on. So what happened then to the Scandinavian model if you get this trust is diminishing, you don't really believe in the institutions in society anymore. And for those who are going to work with the potential radicalized, how do they differentiate who are the radical and who are the one who will commit to violence and who are they not? So this means that the model probably would have to change. I don't think it is a model that will fall apart or be removed in any way, because this is a model that has a lot of support, and it is a model that also build on how we treat crime in Norway. But I think we need to update those who work with radicalization. They need to be aware of all these new tendencies and trends that we see. It means that maybe they should stop looking just for marginalized individuals. Some of those individuals might come from students at universities or other age groups than previously. So we need to have an update of the model, I think, and we need to take in the new situation we are in and what's to come in order to save this Scandinavian model. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Professor Jore. Definitely some concepts we haven't started talking about, so I'm sure there'll be some questions at the end. Our next presentation is online. It is from Libasut Taqwa. He's from the Wahid Foundation in Indonesia. He will be presenting on Indonesia's National Action Plan on Countering Violent Extremism, the case of local government implementation. You are online. Can you hear us?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I am really glad to join this event, but I apologize I can't join offline, but I think the event is going good and running well. So I hope I can join the offline event on another occasions. Ladies and gentlemen, what I am going to talk about is about Indonesia's National Action Plan on Countering Violent Extremism, or we call it in Bahasa Indonesia is as RAN-PA, the case of local government implementations. Since 2021, Indonesia has ratified a national action plan on preventing and countering violent extremisms. The implementation itself is targeted for approximately 2021 to 2024. This NAP, the National Action Plan, particularly functions to enhance inter-ministerial and multi-stakeholder partnerships in Indonesia to address VE. This includes mandating local governments formulate local policies when implementing NAP. The NAP itself consists of an introduction and a strategy that is complemented by PCVE actions. It also aims to increase the protections of citizens' rights to feel safe from violent extremism. In particular, Indonesian NAP has several main targets, particularly to increase interministerial and institutional coordinations and partnerships in order to prevent PCVE. It is also increase the local government's role, civil society, and other partners in PCVE program implementations. For an overview of the RAN-PE or NAP implementations, in 3 years of implementations, the Indonesian government has achieved several significant achievements. Especially, they are increasing coordinations between ministries and institutions. It's quite difficult situation before the NAP implementations, because some note that Indonesia have lack of coordination and partnership between the ministries. Somehow say that the lack of coordination and partnership because of its huge and many ministries. We have around 48 ministries and institutions, And the challenges also happens 3 years before during the RAN PE or NAP implementations. Several achievements can be said also in the increasing of institutions and civil society partnerships. Indonesia also have a kind of framework and platform that provide CSOs and governments partnerships that for certain issues have been successfully implemented. In addition, the central government's data collections, monitoring, and reporting system for the implementation of the NAP in the region is increasingly improving. However, in almost 3 years of implementation, we can easily note that this NAP tended to be only effective at the national levels. And only a few local governments follow the implementation mandates. In fact, according to some literatures, terrorist activities at the local level are increasing, and the terrorist networks are now mushrooming or spreading in the locals rather than in the nationals, such as Jakarta or in Surabaya. So the challenge at least can be noted as three kinds of situations. First, the government's focus is hampered by the coordinations, framework, and infrastructure between ministries and institutions. So implementation in the regions is hampered. Some regional governments do not have adequate capacity to anticipate and prepare a framework for implementing VE prevention in the regions. Also, the implementation is still limited to regional initiatives because there is no strong mandates from the central governments. This research focus on local policies passed by the regional governments. At least for now, there are 8 local action plans prepared as the follow-up of the national action plan. But with varied in content and especially in adopting democratic values that adopted by the national action plan itself. So the national action plans basically adopted principles. They have several principles that in line with the democratic values, such as respecting human rights, supremacy of law, gender mainstreaming, and fulfilling children's rights, security, and good governance. This research will review 8 local action plans, mainly in Java, West Java, East Java, and Central Java, and several others in Lampung Province, Aceh Province, Bandung, Central Sulawesi, and Solo. So the research will compare those action plans, and we can see how the variations of the democratic values adopted within the local action plans. But before going to that discussion, the need for local government implementation itself is also a salient factor in Indonesia. We can name so many actions, terrorist acts, and violent extremism actions during the last 10 years in Indonesia. According to BNPT, National Counterterrorism Agency, BNPT officials, more than 2,000 suspects and perpetrators of terrorism were arrested for the last 20 years. And in terms of impact, Indonesia ranked 37th out of 135 countries most affected by terrorism cases. And now, as I said earlier, most of those terrorist networks are now spreading in the local. Of course, we can see that salient actions still happen in the capitals like Jakarta or Medan or Surabaya and Bandung, but their networks are now mainly, spreading in the local. However, an important issue that emerged in the formations of these local action plans was uneven distributions of information from the central government to various regional stakeholders. We also have noted that there are no clear guidelines regarding the form and the substance of the national action plans. This can be seen from a wide variety of substance from each regions. It is also due to the different spectrum of multi-stakeholders involvement. There is a tendency for local governments to ignore democratic values such as gender mainstreaming, civil society involvement, and human rights in the policy designs. That can reduce the effectiveness of the PCVE initiatives. I summarize several notes on local action plans. As we can see that I summarize at least 4 principles that adopted in the National Action Plan, such as gender mainstreaming and its variants, gender mainstreaming, gender role, etc., human rights, good governance, and law enforcement. In Bandung local action plan, we can see that gender mainstreaming was adopted, and also mostly in Java, West Central Java, Central Java, and East Java. The issue of gender mainstreaming is quite good, and they can't improve that kind of issues. But we can see that in Lampung province local action plan in that area, we have no evidence that the action plans, the policy, adopt gender mainstreaming and its variants. We can't see that kind of issues in the policy. We can also see a limited adoption of the gender mainstreaming in Solo or in Solo in Solo because somehow they abandon the theoretical or the definitions or the term of the gender mainstreaming, but at the practical implementations, they they note that to implement several issues regarding the PCVE initiative, they should involve like women movements or youth and girl movement or communities to support the government to implement the PCVs. We can say that according to the CSO's network report, the intensity of CSO interventions at the local level influence the extent to which democratic values are adopted in the local action plans and policies. Regions with high levels of CSO intervention are regions with local action plans that adopt democratic values, especially on gender mainstreaming and human rights issues. But to some extent, CSO interventions is also limited by expertise and resources. We can say that because of the huge islands that Indonesia have, we have a variety of resources, not only for the for the government, but also the CSOs, that show that CSO intervention is also limited by, as I said, expertise and resources. For instance, not many CSOs on the PCV issues focus on law enforcement. Mostly, we can note in several main cities like Jakarta and Bandung, many CSOs are active in gender mainstreaming issues and movements, also human rights issues and good governments. But we can, but quite difficult to find that kind of issues in the local CSOs, and their attention is not as salient as gender issues or human rights. Concluding remarks and recommendation. In the 3 years of AP implementation, the need to maximize implementation at the local level has increased. However, the capacity of local governments quite varied in the context of adopting democratic values, which are the principles of the NAP itself. In areas with a significant amount of CSO interventions, the adoption of democratic values can be maximized. On the other hand, the regions with low level of CSO intervention, the adoption of democratic values is still challenges. Apart from varying CSO capacities, regional government bureaucrats still experience resource challenges in adopting and implementing that democratic values, in addition to the challenge of budget and administrative problems. This research recommend that the central government institutions need to improve interagency coordinations to ensure that the mandate for the implementation of RAMPA involves multi-stakeholders, especially the CSOs and academia or the education institutions. For examples, maybe that mandating the CSOs be officially involved in various NAP implementations processes in the regions or prone regions to enrich their knowledge capacity on PCVE and accordance with democratic values. In this case, I think that the involvement of academics and educational institutions needs to be increased to reduce harsh approaches that are dominated by the security apparatus. I think that's all, ladies and gentlemen. If you have any further questions or suggestions, it will be good for my research. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Libasut. If you would like to stay online, we'll have another presentation and then come back to if anybody has any questions. We're travelling around the globe and we're coming straight back to Deakin University. So our next two presenters are Dr. Christine Horn and Mark Duckworth from Deakin University, and they are going to be presenting on the importance of trust in government policies for preventing violent extremism.
Thank you very much. Christine and I are going to do a little bit of a double act. I'm going to start off with a brief introduction to our project, and then Christine will go through some of the methodology before we come back to some of our findings, at which time we're going to ask you some questions. So take notes. We've been talking about trust a lot in the last couple of days. So there's a lot of anxiety about the collapse of trust in government institutions. And given that trust is the glue that holds society together, we're all aware of its importance. Indeed, the World Economic Forum a few years ago said, we know that trust is a must if we are to solve the challenges we are facing as a collective. There's a vast literature on the epistemology of trust. Many great thinkers, Anthony Giddens, Ulrich Beck, Francis Fukuyama, and others have written extensively about trust. We've examined these, but that's the last we hear about them this afternoon. This project has been intensely practical, and we've been thinking about some of the reasons why trust is important and why that trust relationship breaks down. And there are two important things about the project we want to talk about, two the things which are the origins of this. The first is about reciprocity. Trust is not a one-way street. It's a relationship. It's a reciprocal relationship. And there's been a lot of work done over the last 60 years on trust by communities in government and its decline. There has been relatively little work done on the other part of that reciprocal relationship, which is trust by governments in communities. And as we point out here, the need to, as has been pointed out by Yang in the quote we have here, that trust is mutual and reciprocal. Citizens will not trust public administrators if they know or feel that public officials do not trust them. And one of the origins of this project was some work done by Michelle Grossman on her chapter on resilience to violent extremism and terrorism, when she pointed out that trust is not a static variable, but rather a multi-systemic and dynamic process of flows, hence the term Trust Flows Project. The next key issue is that trust lies at the heart of many government policies on PCVE, disaster resilience, community resilience, and this project is part of a larger stream of work into resilience to social harms. Resilience building is a key part of PCVE policies in Australia, and it's a core part. If you examine resilience policies and a whole lot of other policies, trust is there, as is discussion of issues around empowerment and co-production. And as an example of this, we have the 2010 white paper, the first articulation in a public articulation of national CVE policy, which actually is quite clear in saying that the work that the paper was setting out will require government policies that help build trust, respect, and a sense of belonging within Australian society, and serve to undermine the appeal of violent extremism. The other key aspect to this is, in terms of one of the reasons that's driven us to this research, is the fact that all these policies talk about trust and empowerment and co-production, and yet there is an issue which my past experience as a practitioner, but also discussion with many communities, often the aim of the policy has not been met. And some of the things we're looking at is what are the impediments to implementation of policies that talk about co-production, that talk about empowerment, that talk about the importance of trust building. And we've been examining some of the reasons why that may happen. And there's experience that we've had, and my own experience of working in disaster recovery communities complaining that recovery was being done to them rather than with them. And while on the other hand, there are projects which have worked. And so we've been looking and discussing people about what's worked and what hasn't worked and what we learned from that. And I now hand over to Christine to take us through the methods in our research.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm just going to explain a little bit how we went about the project and the kind of methodology we used. The project was done at CRIS, at ADI, at Deakin University, and it was a research that was, the research team was Mark Duckworth, myself, Chad Whelan, who isn't here, and Michelle Grossman. We started out doing a comprehensive literature review, first of all, of the concept of trust, because it is a word that is often used, but often not very well defined. That took us through to a rapid review that included about 50 academic articles, books, and these were specifically focused on the concept of government trust in citizens. So there's obviously a lot written about whether or not citizens trust their governments, but the reverse, really, we found only about 50 documents that were focused on that specific issue. So our empirical research was structured around 3 case studies. These were the 2019 to 20 bushfires, the COVID epidemic, and countering violent extremism. But we found that most of the literature was actually more grouped around different themes, in particular around police and policing, and the relationship between citizens and the police, or communities and the police, public policy, and government services, so welfare services, tax services, etc. We then started compiling the empirical data, and to do this, we had interviews with 20 participants. Some of them were in government, and some of them were in community organizations, community leaders, because we wanted to have a look whether different people understand trust in the same way, and whether there's an understanding of the processes that lead to trust that are shared between the different groups. So what we found in the literature was that there's another quote by Young, because there are 2 papers that are basically referenced by all of the literature that we found for our literature review. But we soon found out that trust is often conceptualized as something that it is either there or it isn't there. So most people that research government trust and citizens look at the amount of trust that there is and the kind of determinants or the kind of circumstances under which it either exists or doesn't exist. So whether that is related to gender, personal experience, age, time on the job, etc. So it is more conceptualized as sort of something that can be measured, or that is maybe, or there are preconditions for it. But what we found out when we started doing our empirical research was that most people actually had very different ideas about what trust is and how trust comes about. So the number one thing that people talked to us about during the interviews was trust as a relationship. So there's a certain element where trust is built over time and through interactions. And one person in the quote actually compared it to a bank account that you basically pay in through a certain kind of positive interaction. So someone else said that trust is iterative. So you kind of have to meet at a certain point, and then you meet again and again, and over time, trust builds up with knowledge of the other person. So it was actually quite a different idea of what trust is and how trust comes about and how trust can be fostered, which we thought was quite interesting or important. We then also asked our participants what helps to build trust between government and communities. And we found out that there were a lot of opinions around having personal connections with the people that they were talking to. So I think this idea that there's government and there's community, but really there's mostly people, and you want to get to know a person on a certain level so that it makes it easier to talk about professional things, or politics or finances or whatever it is that you want to be talking about. So a lot of people said that you can't really just try to build up a trusting relationship if there's an issue. There's that idea that you actually have to invest time and resources into building up relationships outside of crisis times, whether these are emergencies or CVE interventions or any other kind of circumstance in which these interactions were taking place. And some of the problems that that people started mentioning were around high turnover in organizations, where people don't really have that opportunity to engage in those relationships, but also maybe sometimes a lack of funding, where there isn't really time or budget for making these relationships happen. So from our 20 interviews, we transcribed and coded them, and we generated a list of key concepts and key trust processes and behaviors. So these are words that either came up in the conversations, or they were sort of underlying concepts that people maybe spoke around in different terms or in different ways. And also the processes or the behaviors that people explained to us were fostering trust in relationships where trust was evident. And so what we did was we took these principles and behaviors and we turned it into a trust checklist. And I'm going to hand it back over to Martin to explain.
Thanks. This is one of the things we'd like to talk to you a bit about, if we can, is we created this checklist to be useful both for people in government and communities to understand the types of behaviours and expectations of each other in terms of building and maintaining relationships of trust. What makes things work, what sustains something, and what breaks them. And there are a number of principles that we outlined, which these are just the headings here, about trust building, about shared responsibility, about new ways of working together, which is that concept of doing co-design rather than just using co-design as a fancy word for consultation. But also an issue people kept coming back to was about funding, both in disaster resilience, but also in CVE projects. What actually is going on here when a community is funded by government to do things, and these are some of the issues that came back a number of times. So there's a lot of words here, but this is just a draft of the 2 pages of the checklist, looking at the processes and behaviours that build trust. Based upon the interviews, we talk about some of the behaviours that both build or reduce trust. One of the first ones that was mentioned to us lots of times is that government often doesn't change, for all sorts of reasons which make good sense in terms of bureaucracies, that people change a lot. So how does a community build up a trusting relationship with a government agency if the person they're dealing with keeps changing? So I know that creates all sorts of other problems within government, but that we're just reporting what was reported to us. And so there's a question, if you don't have someone you can talk to quite often, how do they know that a government's actually fully invested in that relationship? The other thing, and this was particularly raised quite openly, and if you see things like the ABC documentary in the People's Republic of Malakuta, you will get some of this sense that people fly in from whether it's Canberra, Sydney or Melbourne and fly out again. What's the nature of that trusting relationship, of that building familiarity and awareness? There's also the fact who government talks to. In fact, the community may be quite diverse, but government only talks to a select part of the communities. The third point there is about cultural awareness. There's a lack of understanding of the cultural overlay. And a key point here is also about not valuing community experience. And this has arose in a number of different circumstances. As Christine mentioned, some of which related to some of we've spoken a lot about COVID-19, but the health issues that communities, and it's also arisen in relation to natural disasters. Communities will say that they actually have an awful lot of experience and knowledge, but that is sometimes not valued by government actors. And so that was a key point that in fact goes back to another point, that communities are often seen by governments as problems rather than resources or assets. And when that happens, that also undermines that. The issue of communication, not communicating between crises, it goes back to a point that's often raised in CV programs. People only talk to communities when they want something from them, and that's an issue that got raised, which doesn't build a trust relationship. And another issue is about communicating with communities. This issue about expecting communities to speak the language of government and understand government processes, and therefore often preferencing those communities that have that understanding. And talking about community-led, but not actually letting community lead. So it's a link to that issue around co-design and co-production. So the other thing about some of these key concepts, which I'll just touch on very briefly, about reliability and accountability and respect, it's been pointed out to us that should be a willingness to have open, constructive but respectful disagreements about issues, and that should not undermine that a trusting relationship can survive that. An issue questions often raised about accountability, and this is raised about this funding issues. Governments obviously have a whole lot of accountability mechanisms relating to finance, which is also well understood, but the fact that there are often conditions that make it difficult for communities to operate in a grant-giving situation. and whether or not in governments and announcing a program and spending money are more interested in compliance than in impact. And that was mentioned by a number of the community representatives discussed. On the other hand, a couple of key things from government point of view is that communities who will speak to the media about a problem before they've actually gone through talking to government officials about it, that undermines trust from that point of view. And also the fact, when we talk about accountability, that with agency does come responsibility. And so how in fact, there's a better understanding within communities around that. And it goes back to a broader issue around communities having the capacity building of communities when working with governments and understanding how these things work. So my question very briefly from people here is whether or not that type of summary and that type of checklist is something, as we continue to refine and develop, it is useful, or whether it's not.